These 7 settings are the ones that I usually use every day on my photo walks. They work on every camera except the bonus tip, that is the hidden gem and the secret weapon on my Ricoh GR3x. Hi, it's Peter here, and let's get on with the video. And part 1, exposure. Shutter speed for motion. This is a really important decision to make. Do you want your subject to show some motion blur, or you want them to be freezed and pin sharp? I usually want them to be freezed and pin sharp. The reason is that I'm more towards the classical street photography, and that was the way. But there's nothing wrong with a different style. I usually use 1/125th of a second because that will freeze a walking person. There won't be any motion blur. Sometimes if the person is moving really fast, the other leg might be a little bit blurry and there might only be small part that is sharp, but that's totally fine. I like that. Of course, if you want to freeze the traffic and trams and trains and stuff, you might need even faster. Or the second one is aperture for depth. I want to stop down quite a bit because I want most of the scene be sharp, because I think that's part of the street photography, to show the context. I don't want to hide the surroundings. I think it's part of the story, which also makes it a little bit harder to make the composition so that the subject doesn't blend in with the background. With the shallower depth of field, you can do that, but I don't think it's necessary in street photography, because then you will hide many things in the story. But of course, that depends on you. Which one you want? You want more depth of field or shadow depth of field on your street photographs? What's your take on this? Please let us know in the comments down below. And the third one is ISO. What I usually do is set the camera to auto ISO. Then I don't have to worry about it. If I go outdoors and indoors all the time, I don't need to worry about changing the settings. The camera will take care of itself. And I usually limit the highest ISO to 6400, but that of course depends on your camera and how much you tolerate noise in your images. I think Ricoh GR3x is totally fine with 6400. And if you make the proper exposure, of course, if you underexpose, then the images might be quite noisy, maybe even too much for my likings. But proper exposure, there will be no problem with that. I know this is something that many of you say that how do you control the exposure, and don't you use manual or not, or something like that? No, I don't. And that is the exposure compensation, which is the way I manually adjust the exposure. And before I get into that, I will reveal the mode that I use, and that is P mode, which many of you might know. And then I have the 125th second, my minimum shutter speed, and ISO, auto, and maximum is 6400. And then I also have the depth of field priority, so that the Ricoh GR3x will use as small aperture as possible, and it will be combining all these. But then someone might say that, isn't that just letting the camera do the exposure? Yeah, it can make a good starting point, but then I have set the exposure compensation on the back wheel of this camera, which you can do in most cameras nowadays. So if it has a back wheel, this is, in my opinion, the best way to control the exposure and make it manual, even though it's on P mode. With this way, I can always have my finger on the shutter button, and then with the thumb, I can adjust the exposure. And what I usually do is try to save the highlights so that the highlights won't be blown out too much. Of course, that depends a little bit on the image. And here again, what are my settings for exposure? And I think it works the best, at least for me. What do you think? What do you use? Do you think that manual is the only way to go? Or maybe aperture priority, which is also very good, because that is something that I used to use quite a bit, but now I use more shutter speed priority and P mode. Those are the things that I use. And of course, the P mode is possible because I can prioritize depth of field in Ricoh GR3x, which I think is one of the best features in this camera. And then the second part is about focusing, which is also very crucial, because we want to focus the correct way, and that the correct way is to the subject or to the point that we want. That is always something that if you're using autofocus, then it might not focus every time to a place where you want to. Then that's why it's a little bit tricky. And in autofocus, I usually use the face detect priority, which that it will detect the faces, and it usually picks the right face because I don't have my images that crowded. But sometimes it doesn't work, and then I use manual focus, which is the zone focus, which I will talk a little bit later. And then with the manual focus also have the tracking on so that it will track your subject. So if you take several shots, it will keep the tracking on that face that it initially did. And in most cameras, you can use some kind of a joystick on the back or some back wheel or something that you can switch which face. If it doesn't stick on the right face, then you can switch it to another face. I very seldom use that. I'm not even sure if it works on my Ricoh GR3x because I don't use that feature that much. But sometimes it's a good starting point if they're all, if you're photographing people on the streets. It's a good way to start. But what I usually use most is zone focusing, which means that I have the camera pre-focused to a certain distance. When the aperture is quite small, there's no problem with the focusing. Everything will be in focus. And that's I think the fastest and the best way, at least for me. And I will talk at the end with the bonus tip, a very special feature that Ricoh GR3 and 3X cameras have. And I bet the new GR4 has it too. And this works with any camera. If you have a manual lens, for example, for your camera, just, pre-focus to roughly 4 meters and stop down to f8 and you're good to go. Everything will be sharp. You don't have to worry about focusing at all, and everything will be really fast if you have the P mode and then exposure compensation on the back wheel. It's the simplest way and the fastest way to get the action. You don't miss anything because these are things that you cannot be fiddling around when something happens on the street. After you have settings ready, the thing is gone or everything is over and you missed a shot. So having a camera ready all the time is another thing, which means for part 3, optimal workflow. And there is only one on this one before the bonus tip. And that is have the camera always on. That's what I use. And I have set back button so that I can turn off the LCD to serve some reserve some battery life if I don't have anything to shoot. So that also requires, usually I have 3 batteries with me and a charger with me so that I can charge if I need to. Because the only downside on this camera that I've had is the battery life. It's not the best, and that especially if it's getting a little bit cold like it is now here in Helsinki, the battery life isn't that great. So if there is a lot to photograph, then you might need all those 3 batteries on a photo walk. At least that's my experience. I know that some have had some better battery life. One feature that is a lot of battery is the GPS on. If you have the GPS tracker on, it's the battery a lot faster. So that's why I've turned it off and, don't really need the location data on my images. And then the bonus tip, which is a special feature for Ricoh GR3 and 3X and Ricoh GR4 cameras, including the HDF versions. And that is snap focus distance and full press snap. Snap focus distance is a preset zone focusing. I can set this to, let's say, like 5 meters or 3.5 meters, what I usually have. Everything will be in focus when I use a smaller aperture like f7.1 or f8. If I press the FN button, it will go to the 5 meters, and then with the front wheel I can change that to 3.5 or to infinity, whichever I need. But there is a small downside on this because sometimes I had this for 5 meters and I've gone too close and it's unsharp because I forgot to switch it back to normal focusing. But there is another feature that is so-called full press snap. If I press the shutter button halfway, it will use the AF. But if I press it quickly all the way down, it will use the snap focus distance, which I've set for full press snap 5 meters. And the 6 first features or settings will work on any camera. But I don't think there is another camera that has the unique features called snap focus distance or full press snap in any other camera. But you can go around that with manual lenses and pre-focusing to a certain distance, as I was explaining in the part 2, the focusing part. I have updated my best settings PDF, which you can download, and I will put a link to it in the description of this video. And here is my best settings video for you to watch next, which is a little bit more comprehensive than this one. This one was the precise settings for street photography that I use. But hey, thanks for watching and bye for now.